Hey guys, so yesterday in our notes packet, we talked about some of the social psychology and social cognition theory that talks about racism. So today we're mostly going to get into some history of racism, probably some history that I'm guessing you guys aren't super familiar with because I'm sure you do know a lot of the history of like the civil rights movement in the United States, and obviously slavery and all that stuff is stuff that you guys I think would have probably certainly talked about in your US history classes, so I don't think we need to cover that. So for today, we're going to talk about a part of history of racism that's probably lesser known called social Darwinism. So I'm hoping if you remember back to your science classes, you'll remember learning about Darwin, Charles Darwin, and his theory of evolution that came out of his landmark document on the origin of species, in which he wrote about this process that he calls natural selection. So after Darwin published on the origin of species, a new version of what he believed in became more popular in the late 1800s called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism really kind of goes back to a guy named Herbert Spencer. He took Darwin's work and he kind of ran with it, but he ran with it in a really ugly way. He actually coined the phrase that we often associate with Darwin, survival of the fittest. Darwin never said survival of the fittest. Herbert Spencer did, and that actually really goes back to this idea of social Darwinism. What Spencer believed that Darwin really never talked about, and as far as I know, didn't believe himself. What Spencer believed was that people could inherit learned characteristics from their parents. That is, like parents and their genetics could pass on learned characteristics to their children. This was a fairly common belief in the 1800s in the US, in Western Europe. The idea for Spencer was that the fitter people, like people who were more intelligent or industrious or frugal, mostly in this case people who were white and wealthy, were able to pass on those characteristics to their children. So Spencer would say if your parents are hardworking, that they passed on, in a sense, the genes for hardworkingness to their children. And that people that he called the quote-unquote unfit, right, passed on qualities like laziness or stupidity or immorality. Obviously, this is an erroneous idea. People don't actually pass on learned characteristics. They learn it themselves from socialization and from all those other ideas, but that's what Spencer believed, that there actually was a genetic component to those kinds of characteristics. What Spencer believed is kind of the opposite almost of that really silly movie that came out a long time ago called Idiocracy, if any of you guys have ever seen that movie. He believed that unfit people would actually begin to die off, that they would fail to thrive because of their weakness and their kind of inherent weakness, and that the government should not interfere with this process. So what kind of came out of that, eventually, in Germany, a biologist named Ernst Haeckel combined social Darwinism with his own kind of romantic ideas about Germany and the German people. He divided humankind into races and ranked them. And of course, no one will be surprised if you look at German history that he ranked a group that he called Aryans at the top, and put Jews and Africans at the bottom of his ranking. This is the first time historically, by the way, that Jews are known or considered to be their own race. Up until this point, Judaism is a religion, not a race. But it's Ernst Haeckel who will call Jews their own race. And that eventually, of course, will lead to the real ugliness of the Holocaust eventually. What that looks like in the United States and in England too, social Darwinists, which is unfortunately becomes a very popular ideology, believe that we should reward the strong, and as a result, they oppose any kind of government aid to the poor. They oppose welfare programs. They oppose what we would today call things like food stamps and welfare. They want to do everything they can to essentially let those people that they call, quote unquote, unfit people, they want to let them die off. As history will see, it really doesn't actually happen, of course, but that's what they want. Spencer and his followers argue that anyone who tries to do good things for what he calls good for nothings actually harm society by stopping the natural process. This is a quote from him here at the bottom. By stopping that natural process, that natural process of elimination by which society continually purifies itself. This is a lot of the history that's going to be seen and used by Hitler and the Nazis in World War II, who are going to argue that by killing Jews in the Holocaust, that they're purifying society of these good-for-nothing people. This is a really ugly time in history for this kind of racism, and it's such a sad, sad part of our own history that this became really popular in the United States as well. So we're going to take a pause there just for a second. Okay, so what we're going to do, just this last little section for you to think about, are there places where we see this idea of eugenics? Eugenics is kind of, by the way, the scientific arm of social Darwinism. These were people who thought that they could prove social Darwinism using science. So, like measuring, different, like how big brains were and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. All those kind of nightmare stories that you hear from the Holocaust about these different doctors and people doing these experiments on different people's races and comparing them. That's the science of eugenics, and that really came out of social Darwinism. So one of the things I want you to think about is, do we see remnants of social Darwinism in our own culture today? Do we still see a legacy of those beliefs today? The last thing that you guys are going to do is to look at another very ugly part of the history of racism, and again, a part that's really not as well known, that really played a big role in the way that the city of Chicago has ended up looking in the world, the way that segregation still exists in the different neighborhoods of the city of Chicago. So we're going to look at one of those lesser known aspects of racism that's known as redlining, and how we get these very segregated neighborhoods, and especially in the city of Chicago, but lots of other cities in the United States have similar stories to the one Chicago has. So I hope that all makes sense. Please email me or use Remind if you have any questions.